Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm well, thank you for asking, Rory. And both Rory and I hope that you are well as our listener. You're tuning in to episode 216 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And today we have three different topics. We're going to start off by visiting those counselling foundations, the important foundations that underpin our practice as counsellors. And today we're going to be examining the skill of challenging. Then we're going to focus on self, which recognizes that we are the heart of our practice. And we're going to be looking at what we do when friends or acquaintances find out that we're a counselor and they go, "Oh, I've got a problem. Let me tell you what it is to see how you can help me." And then we're going to be ending today's episode with practice matters and an interesting interview held with Joe Mountain on insurance for counsellors and psychotherapists. So a packed episode is this 216th episode. And we're starting off, Rory, with the challenge of the skill of challenge.
I see what you did there, Ken. Very good. And yeah, it's an interesting skill. And I'm going to be honest, I think it's a skill that some practitioners, certainly students, find a bit challenging. I know I've said it. I've said it, because it can feel so incongruous. When initially we talked about, the necessary and sufficient conditions. If you're learning person-centered or any relational model, the idea that you would challenge your client seems a bit kind of, wrong. But there are some times that we have to challenge clients. And it struck me that actually now a lot of practitioners are working in a blended way, both face-to-face and online. The online world may need a little more challenge.
Yeah.
And certainly it may need, we may need to think about how we do that. But, first of all, Ken, let's think of why we would challenge a client. What are the things that we challenge a client for? And I can think one off the top of my head. If a client came into the room and they may be clearly under the influence of medication, prescribed medication, street drugs, or alcohol, and they are not in a place that they can actually make psychological contact and continue the session.
Yeah, they may be late for the session and have given no notice and arrived 20 minutes late for the session. There would be room for inquiry, maybe a gentle challenge there as well. And I think that you touched on a really important point when it comes to challenge, Rory, is that we need to look at our modality. Challenge is modality specific. So if you were working as a cognitive behavioral therapist, the challenge would be different. Somebody might not do the homework that was assigned to them, and you would be looking to challenge that, because without them doing that work, their progress would be hampered. I think when we look to person-centered, I think that is where there is a grey area. And I've seen, you mentioned with students struggling with challenge, I've actually seen conversations out in social media where certain people are saying, well, you can't really challenge in person-centered because it's just client-led and the client is leading the way. And, I look at that and maybe I just have a small smile on my face as I look at it, because, of course, person-centered therapy is all about challenge, because Carl Rogers recognized that there is an incongruence within a client where they feel one thing inside, but they'll be showing something differently outside. They're almost playing a part within the world, being the person that other people want them to be, as opposed to being their real self. And part of that process is challenging that incongruence. And even if that is done in a very, very gentle way, or maybe a little more directive, there is an element of challenge in person-centered therapy.
You're absolutely right, Ken. And as Rogers famously alluded to, when the person who can accept themselves can change and grow. And I think that part of that challenge may be helping the clients accept themselves. And I want to touch on what you said about CBT, about not doing the homework, but actually the homework itself could be challenging.
Yeah.
The homework itself could be challenging. And if we look to theories like Gestalt, things like two-chair work, doing the experiments, top dog, underdog. They're all a form of challenge. They're meant to put the client in a position where they have to, a grasp and a kind of move towards personal growth. Self-actualization by its very nature is challenging. So it really is built in to therapy. But I think it as always in any relationship, in any therapy, there's a relationship. And I think it's about how that challenge is done. When we challenge, we do it with maybe high challenge, but high support. We underpin the discomfort of what's being said by understanding how it may be received and how difficult it could be for someone to hear that.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I guess, looking at the different models, as you've mentioned there, Rory, if you're looking at transactional analysis, you may challenge somebody about what ego state they might have been at that moment. You may within the interaction say, and it seemed like you were maybe in the child ego state there, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge with the work being, I guess, to lift from that child ego state. And again, back to person-centered therapy, where there is challenge within the relationship. What is interesting for me is that in a person-centered manner, when you are walking with that person, you're empathic with them, unconditional positive regard. You're not judging who they are or where they are or even what they bring. So you're not challenging any part of that. But again, going into that incongruence, a person might say, I'm feeling absolutely distraught, but I present at work telling everybody that I'm fine. And the challenge might be, inside you're feeling absolutely broken, but you find that you're presenting yourself outside as oh, I'm okay, and I wonder how that is for you. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge to look at the other. It's a challenge on that incongruence, and maybe a gentle challenge, and maybe wouldn't be seen, I'm putting inverted commas here, as a challenge as some would understand it, but it is a form of gentle challenge. And I guess when we think about challenge, we started off by saying under the influence of alcohol, arriving late. These are based in, I guess, the management of the practice rather than in the therapeutic relationship. We wouldn't go into a therapeutic relationship if psychological contact was not possible because the person was influenced in some way by a substance. And those kind of challenges would maybe be around what was contracted. If we'd contracted on a given time, it would be quite a direct challenge. It would be, we agreed on this, but I'm recognizing this. And then there might be a recontracting around that. So a person is late, 20 minutes, no heads up was given that they might be late. And then they may present and say, well, I was stuck in traffic, and that's all good and well. But maybe they could have sent a text, or maybe they could have called through their hands-free kit or something like that. So it might be worth revisiting what the contract says about that, so that there is once again a mutual a respect for the time boundaries that have been set. But of course, outside of the management of the session, there is the challenge that happens within the session itself. And I guess that is a different kind of challenge. So we are working with different kinds of challenge, different flavors of challenge as counselors, psychotherapists.
Absolutely. And thinking about the online world, challenge, you may need to use challenge more than you think. We know about John Sewler's disinhibition effect, where people may have fantasy relationships with their therapist. Certainly on the phone, one of the things that's now being recognized in the online world, certainly by phone, people who do phone only, is that kind of fantasy attachment, where the person's talking to another voice on the phone, and they build a whole attachment and fantasy of who the therapist is. And that might lead to some quite interesting roads. It could be, the transference could be seen as a father or mother figure, or even a romantic figure, because there's no kind of frame of reference. So I think there's challenge there. And also for those people who work through video platforms, the challenge may be that somebody turns up, shall we say, in a state of dress, that isn't appropriate for a counselling session. And I'm not saying we should tell our clients how to dress, but I do think that if a client turns up undressed, which could happen, that maybe we need to challenge that and speak about it. And certainly little things like, the client undertaking counselling by doing other things. They may be cooking a meal and having counselling, and you might want to say, I understand you've got things to do, but actually this space is for you to actually talk about what's going on for you. And I can see that you're cooking lunch. So there again, there would be a challenge. And I wonder, Ken, if the idea of challenge and how therapists use challenge is probably more predominant online than face-to-face. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I don't know. I think that there's maybe more practice management challenge. So what you've just been mentioning there is all about practice management challenge, where somebody is attending online therapy from their car on the way to drop the kids off because they've been running a bit late, and I hope you don't mind. Well, of course, we're going to challenge that. It's not appropriate for them to be able to engage in their therapy. But I think once in the actual sessions itself, it becomes the therapeutic challenge, which is different. The therapeutic challenge is different to challenge around the contract or them not being there or arriving late or being under the influence. And the skill of challenge is at its most effective when it is a therapeutic challenge, when we're working therapeutically in service of the client, where the challenge is not... it is there for them to, I guess, reconsider, look at something a little bit differently, maybe re-examine something. And I think that can be really, really powerful. And I'm going to give an example of therapeutic challenge. And I'm going to use a person-centered model here just to keep to the theme of that you might not use challenge in person-centered, and show you where challenge would be highly appropriate in the following scenario. And this is something that will present often, and you will, if you're in practice, you will have seen it. And if you're not in practice and you're going into practice, you're gonna see this. And it's when a client presents with a painful part of their life. So they're telling you some heavy material, something that has got some weight to it, some pain to it. And as they're telling you, they're kind of got a bit of a giggle, like almost a nervous laugh that comes out. And that is a coping mechanism. It is a coping mechanism that we will put out. And what we want to avoid is colluding with a client there and mirroring that laugh or that small giggle. But what we can do is we can listen intently with empathy, and we can say, Rory, as you were saying that, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that emotion you're carrying. But I noticed as you were saying it, you were laughing. There's a challenge.
Yeah. I'm
saying, look at that emotion you're bringing, but look at what you're showing externally. Again, it's that incongruence. I'm feeling something inside, but I'm showing something different outside. And that can be really effective, a therapeutic challenge, where that person can receive that and go, wow, yes, actually, maybe that's a nervous laugh. And I've heard that a number of times in therapy. I think it's a nervous laugh. I don't know what else to do. And now you're in the material. I hear you say that the laugh is kind of from nerves, and that you don't know what other options might be available for you. And there you're giving that space for them to maybe consider that, maybe look for other alternatives, a different way of presenting that. There's an example of therapeutic challenge.
I think that's a great example. And I think that, with trauma-informed work, when you're working with clients who may be disassociating, or they may be moving back to an earlier developmental age within the session, one of the challenge when we're using grounding techniques is to bring them into the here and now, not the there and then. Of course, we acknowledge the there and then, but the here and now is where they actually exist. And, I have said to clients, I hear what you're saying, but you are in a safe space. That person isn't in your life anymore. And, you're not a child, you're an adult. And, that is quite challenging. And I want to share a story of challenge that I heard from not a client, but someone I worked with many years ago who was recovering from substance misuse. And he went to see a counsellor, and he'd used a substance before he went. And the counsellor could obviously tell he'd used a substance. And halfway through the session, the person I knew said, "I'm going to have to leave now because I've got to go and babysit my kids." And the counsellor said, I wouldn't let you look after my kids in the state you're in." And I thought at the time, oh my gosh, that is such a challenge. I'm not sure I would have done it. However, it was an eye opener for the person that I knew. And it was a catalyst of change. Somebody held a mirror up to him. And it was like, oh my goodness, am I in that such a state because I've used it? And it actually set him on the path of recovery. So, I think don't underestimate challenge, but, think about how it's used. And I think as it comes down, if you're a student, practice it, practice.
Yeah, and the example that you've used there, Rory, you've gone to recovery.
Yeah,
and recovery is by nature a challenging process. And those that work in recovery will know, I worked in recovery for some years, that you will use high challenge within the recovery journey. You have to. It's part of part of the way of working with recovery. And it is, again, it's about, challenge does not mean telling somebody they're doing something wrong. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is when we're talking about maybe somebody arriving late, or we're not really telling them that they're doing it wrong, but we're kind of highlighting it and going, I wonder if we could look at this. Therapeutic challenge can be positive. So an example of therapeutic challenge that is positive is where we might use where a person was and where a person is now. As you're saying that, Rory, I'm now acting, of course, the counsellor and for those that don't know, can't look inside my head and see what I'm thinking. So, Rory, you are now the person that has presented, and I am now the counsellor reflecting back. And you've just said something, and I go, "Wow, Rory! As you're saying that, I can't help but think that when you first came in, you mentioned that's something you could never do. But now I noticed you've just mentioned you've done it."
Yeah.
And that's a challenge.
Yeah,
that is a challenge. You said this, and now look, you're doing that. And when we have a moment of movement, we can use challenge with that. Yeah. We can put in a challenge. And challenge is not a negative thing. It's not bringing somebody up of something they were supposed to do that they didn't do. It is a therapeutic skill. And we've got a handout to help to help with challenge. And you can get that handout for free. You just go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our hub. It's where we all live. Counsellingtutor.com. In the top menu bar, you will find the podcast tab. Find your way to episode 216, that's 216, and right there in that page, you can download the Skill of Challenge worksheet, which will cover some of what we've covered today and give you an understanding of that skill of challenge. And just to kind of close this off with what you said, Rory, practice it, challenge.
Absolutely, Ken. Practice, and get the feedback from the practice. Definitely.
Like it. So moving away from our Counselling Foundations, and we're going right now into that focus on self, where we look at you. We are the beating heart of our practice, and we've got to look at all different aspects of practice. And today we're looking at what we do when a friend or an acquaintance finds out that we're a counsellor or a psychotherapist, and they go, "Oh, I'm struggling with such and such. What should I do?" So when a friend asks you to help them out, what do you do, Rory?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, Ken. And what I have to say is, we have to kind of start as we mean to go on. Of course, as friends, we want to be helpful, kind, compassionate, and supportive. I guess depending on the level of friendship. I mean, there's different friendships, mean different things to people. I've got friendships where I'm on the kind of nodding acquaintances with people, and I've got some very strong, deep, long-held friendships. And I think, it's a case of starting as you mean to go on. And I think, it's really about contracting and saying, well, I can listen, if you've got some problems, but actually it sounds to be like you need to see a counsellor, and explain why you cannot be a counsellor to your friend. And also, one of the things I've observed through the years, listening to friends' difficulties, is to be thoughtful. You don't start a process off. And, that's quite easily done by, tuning up your empathy, tuning up your unconditional positive regard and your congruence, and starting to become the process of a therapist and offer that permission, because it can be a very slippery slope. You're in a dual relationship to start off with. And in my experience, it never works out. And I say to my friends, I say, I'm happy to listen. I can't advise you. And if I believe that someone's got a real issue, I say, look, I always love to hear from you. And I can see you going through a really difficult time, but, I think you need to see someone who's, someone you don't know, a therapist, to speak about your issues, and maybe get it from a different perspective. Because I've got skin in the game here. I'm biased. I'm your friend. Maybe seeing it from someone else's perspective. And I think, sadly, one of the things I found out through the arc of training is that some of your friends can become quite dependent on you. And I'll be really honest, I've had friendships end because I got a little fed up with them being phoned up every other day, asking me to counsel them. And I've had to say to them, we've spoken about this, you need to see a counsellor. And of course, the reaction sometimes could be, I thought you're my friend and you're a counsellor and you won't help me. If you're a plumber, you'd come around and repair my cistern, but you're not going to help me. And I think for your own sanity, if you're a student listening to this, for your own sanity, you really do need to kind of draw a line in the sand, or you will never stop being a therapist. And you do need to stop, and you need to re-engage with the other aspects of your life. You need a holistic life, not just be a therapist, because I think it speaks to burnout, and I think it speaks to the fact that you may get into some very difficult situations with friends.
This is an interesting topic. I'm glad that you brought it today, Rory. So here's the thing. Ethically, we cannot counsel a friend or a family member. We just can't. And there's a very good reason for it. Well, first of all, if you look back to the very basics of what counseling is, and one of the very first things you learn if you go on any counseling course, your first lesson is going to be, what is counseling? It's going to be the topic of that first lesson. And what is counseling? Well, it is a managed activity. It happens at a certain time, at a certain place, within certain boundaries. It is contracted. It is in service of the client. Notes will be taken that will be kept according to legislation. You will go and you will see a supervisor around that client. A friendship has none of those things in it. None of those things at all. So just by entering, even putting a toe into anything counseling related with a friend, we're putting ourselves in a difficult situation. And I often see out on social media students that might share that they're on a course and they're now learning about counseling skills, and can I practice those at home? And the answer is no. You want to be practicing with a peer and within the confines of your college, your university, your training provider. Of course, you can practice active listening out and about. You can practice active listening when you order a cup of coffee, when you just going about your daily activities. But when it comes to a friend, somebody that we know, it's not possible for us to separate ourselves from the counselor. And what I mean by that, Rory, you mentioned the role confusion. If they are a friend, then you have prior knowledge of them. You know situations they've been in before. You might know their partner, their friends. Say a friend of yours might be struggling with their partner, and you know that partner. Well, you have prior knowledge. You're not able to be non-biased within that relationship. You know them. You maybe have an allegiance to them. You may know their partner, and it just murks everything over and makes it, well, not possible for us to be in a therapeutic relationship with that person. I think even just going into an active listening mode can be pretty tricky, because for us, we can go, yeah, okay, I'm actively listening here. I'm not actively counseling. But from them receiving that, they may be receiving our empathy, they may be receiving our unconditional positive regard, and they may mistake that for counseling. It may be confusing for them. And then they may wish to re-engage with that, look for it some more, and ask of us that we are not able to give. So how do you manage that? The best way to manage it is to be clear and upfront the very first time anything comes up, to explain what counseling is really. Because I know that when I went on my counseling course, there I was, I'd paid. I was sat down to now I'm going to become a counselor and learn about counselling. And when the first lesson came up, what is counselling? I was so surprised, especially when they got to the bit, it is not advice giving. I was going, what? Well, then what is it then? If you're not giving advice. So if I didn't know and I'd paid for a counselling course, it's very unlikely that a friend or family member would know what counselling is. So educating them on what counselling is, explaining that it is a managed activity and kind of what I covered before, I'm not going to go over it again, might be helpful for them. And then in best service of that person, you might suggest that if they do have something that they feel that they need to speak to somebody about, you can gladly share where they might find somebody. And you might share your ethical body if they have a register, give them a web address that they may go and look at, and they can empower themselves then to go look around and find somebody that may be able to be there for them. But it is a tricky and sticky situation.
It is, and of course there's a contrary situation to that. It may be that someone asks you something, and you kind of find yourself tuning up. I don't know if this is the process you go through, Ken, but when I hear someone going through a difficult time, I have this process of tuning myself up a bit. Just trying to clear my head of information so I can listen to that person and, turn my empathy dial up a bit, because it's never full on all the time. It goes up and down. And I can remember doing that to someone, and they said, I don't want a counselling session. Didn't realize that was a counselling session. And I was like, oh, that's a lesson learned. So yeah. It is a very, very fine line. And I guess that one of the things that I've realized through the years is you find out who your real friends are when you do a counselling course, because some of them will stick around and they'll become better friends, and you'll have a richer friendship, and some, I'm afraid, will kind of leave you, and they'll move on. They may become a little bit more distance, but it is tricky to navigate. And it continues to be tricky to navigate. I am very thoughtful when I meet someone and they're speaking to me about an issue and they know what I do. I try to be as thoughtful as possible, but it goes with the territory.
Well, there you go. That is Focus on Self. As always, Rory and I do not proclaim to be experts on this at all. We're just two colleagues having a discussion, and we're most interested in what you think about this, and maybe any experiences you may have had of friends asking and how that may have turned off. Of course, we wouldn't share any details of any clients or client journeys because that's confidential, but we can chat as fellow peers and therapists, and the best place to do that is the Counselling Tutor Facebook page. Jump onto Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you will find us, tens of thousands in that group. And we have conversations, deep conversations, interesting conversations on a daily basis. So come and join that conversation. And that moves us on to our Practice Matters, where we look at an element of practice And it could be a client presentation. It could be something around the management of practice. And today is an interesting topic, and it's around insurance. As qualified practitioners, we need to hold insurance to kind of protect our practice, protect ourselves. And Rory, you met up with Joe Mountain to speak about all things insurance.
Yes, I had a lovely interview with Joe Mountain, who's Associate Director of Howden Insurance Brokers. And we asked the audience in our Facebook page to give us some questions. I put them to Joe, and it was very enlightening. And this is what she had to say. And we welcome Joe Mountain from Howden's Insurance, who's very kindly come onto the podcast to talk about insurance and to ask audience questions or to answer audience questions. So, Joe, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Rory. It's nice to be participating.
Well, thank you very much. And Joe, you're in the northern part of the hemisphere, aren't you?
Absolutely, northerner through and through.
So, I'm going to ask some general questions first. So, why is it essential that practitioners have professional indemnity insurance?
Okay, so just to clarify, there are types of insurance that are compulsory, such as motor insurance, and there are types that are not. So they, in essence, is optional. So, and this is a type of insurance that is optional, unless any practitioners are also HCPC registered, in which case it's mandatory. It can be mandatory as part of the membership of a professional association, but otherwise it is optional. But I would say it is essential on two bases. The first one is that if you have a complaint to a professional association, a poor outcome could mean your career, or certainly a reduced career. And the second element is if there is civil action against you, it could be your own personal wealth that's at risk if you don't have insurance to back you. So it's really about having a good defence and having a pot of money to pay out should we need to rely on that.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing here is that different, depending on who you are registered with, and you mentioned the HSPC, which is a professional body that people like Shropper Discs, and I'm thinking about maybe psychologists, art therapists, that type of thing. Yes, it's quite it's slightly different to counselling, but yes, you're absolutely right. Some insurance is mandatory depending on your body. So, what sort of insurance do practitioners need? Is there any specific insurances that practitioners need to consider?
Okay, well, this could be a needle in a haystack, really. So it would depend very much on what size of operation you have, whether it's an individual sole trader, a charity or a company. But in essence, all of those entities are going to need insurance for, firstly, complaints defence. So complaints you made to your professional association, so defence of that complaint and assistance if that goes as far as a hearing. And also to cover civil action, so where somebody is trying to sue you for compensation for something that you've done wrong. So those two are the main elements of cover that I would say everybody needs, regardless of what their company status is.
Well, I think that's really, really helpful. And you mentioned, gaining support should a complaint be levied against you. What kind of support would the insurance offer or be able to access through the insurance?
Okay, so the support that we can provide before we even get to a formal complaint, if there has been a complaint or a grumbling from a client, we can help you with that, help you to pen a response and generally handle the situation. Because you tend to find that you can be put in quite a defensive position, and therefore your responses may not be as helpful as if you were defending somebody else. So it may be a bit defensive. So we can help with that. If it's a formal complaint to a professional association, we help by using our third-party partners, either solicitors or professional conduct companies, who are very well versed with the professional associations, with their code of conduct and the complaints procedure. So in a great position to help pen a response to a complaint in the first instance, and also to attend a hearing if a complaint goes that far.
Well, I mean, I think that is really, really useful. And what would happen if someone was, say, for instance, using their home for therapy? Would they need professional indemnity insurance and maybe a different form of insurance to cover them should a client have an accident or trip over?
Absolutely. So essentially, the policy that Howden provide is what we call a civil liability policy, which covers any civil action. So that can be anything to do with the actual work itself, so the counselling work, or it could be accidentally injuring somebody or damaging their belongings or premises. We include cover for people that work from home. So most household policies will exclude business visitors, and the liability element of a household policy would exclude business visitors. So we would pick that up so that if somebody was injured whilst in your home, if that's where you practice, and you were liable for that injury, then it would be covered under the professional liability policy.
I think that's really helpful, because sometimes we forget that our own home insurance may not cover us if we're using part of our home as a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always a good tip as well to let your home insurers know that you do have business visitors. Most of them won't have a problem with that, apart from potentially excluding the liability. But some don't like people who have business visitors, and it may avoid your policy if you've not told them, and that's subsequently what you're doing. So always let them know.
Well, I think that is really, really useful. Now, there's a lot of talk about the level of training in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. Does the level of training that someone undertakes impact on premiums or cover?
Yeah, it's a very difficult area, because obviously, as you know, Rory, we're not regulated within counselling, whilst there is an element of that by being a member of a professional association. It's not a regulated industry, unlike the psychologists and art therapists that are HCPC registered. But essentially, we recognise that students are very, very closely monitored and in training. So we obviously don't get paid very much for what they do, if at all. So we have a reduced rate for students as against qualified practitioners. And again, we have different premiums for those that are members of professional associations, and therefore sticking with a code of conduct to those that are not.
Yes, and I think that's interesting. So, in terms of Howden's, and I guess different insurance companies may differ in their approach. You offer a kind of a lower premium for students, because you understand that the majority don't get paid during their placement years, but also you offer a lower premiums for those who are members of an ethical body and have signed up to a code of ethics and ethical standard. In terms of actual qualifications, Joe, so someone may have a master's degree, a PhD, or a degree, or a level 4. Does that impact on premiums?
It doesn't. We can't drill down to that degree. We rely on the professional associations to sort out what qualifications are acceptable for accreditation and not. And as long as it gains you membership of a professional body, then that will dictate the premium as qualified or student.
Well, I think that's really clear. So we've asked what practitioners are insured for. What are practitioners not insured for?
That's a good question. So I've just picked out the main points, because obviously what you're not insured for is your home, your car, and all the rest of it. That's obvious sorts of stuff. But the less obvious ones are deliberate acts. So if you deliberately intend to cause harm to a client, not that I'm sure any of our counsellors would, but if you happen to punch somebody on the nose because they'd irritated you, we're not going to provide cover for that. That's your own lookout.
Yes.
What we're also not going to provide cover for is anything that you already knew about before you start insurance. So you can't know about a situation and then take out insurance after that event and expect that it would be covered. So prior knowledge of a situation we would exclude. We don't cover. Sorry, Rory.
What kind of prior knowledge are we talking about? So, what specific thing may someone know and then get insurance for, and not tell you?
So there may already be a complaint lodged against them that they might not tell us about, in which case we're not going to cover it because underwriters may have changed their underwriting stance had they known about that. And even a situation that might give rise to a claim or complaint, we're not going to cover that either if it's something that you knew about before you took out the insurance.
So on a very practical level, it's rather like having an accident in your car and then phoning the insurance company up and saying, oh, I've had an accident. Or when did you have an accident? 3 weeks ago, but the premium only starts today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not covering anything that you already know about. It's too late. If you've not had insurance by then, it's not going to be picked up.
That's really clear. And finally, when should practitioners contact their insurance company? When is the initial contact to the insurance company very, very useful?
Yeah, it's a good point. And people are so caught up in a complaint and how it makes them feel and the trauma of a complaint that they often forget to let us know. But for several reasons you should do. Firstly, because the policy requires you to. Secondly, because we can provide an awful lot of help for you. And the sooner we can do that, the better. So as soon as you become aware of a formal claim or complaint, let your insurance company know straight away. And similarly, if it's not quite formal, but there is a situation which may give rise to a claim or complaint, again, let us know straight away. We can help you manage that situation and hopefully stop it becoming something more formal.
Yeah, so as soon as a difficulty arises, it may be worth contacting your insurance company. Forewarned is forearmed, as we say.
Absolutely.
Now, what happens when a practitioner has a complaint made against them? How does insurance help there?
Okay. So as I touched on earlier, we use third-party partners who are specifically qualified in that area. So we use a professional conduct organisation and a particular solicitor, although we do have a couple of options as well. But we concentrate on using people that are very much within the field, very much within psychological therapy, and know BACP, National Counselling Society, hypnotherapy organisations and so on, inside and out, from both the code of ethics and also the complaints process. So they're very well versed in what that particular organisation are looking for, how they like to have the response framed, what to include, what not to include, and so on. So they would get that support at the initial stage, and should that professional association decide to take it as far as a hearing, they would have representation at that hearing as well.
Yes, that's very reassuring, isn't it? Because I know a lot of therapists think they're on their own if a complaint's levied against them. And what I'm hearing is the insurance company is in your corner, so to speak, right from the beginning. In fact, before even it may even get to a professional body, you can gain advice there.
Absolutely, yeah. The sooner we can help, the better. Because we can be that impartial person that helps you change your responses that might just bring an end to that particular situation.
Yes, and I think that's something that we all need to think about. If we do get a complaint levied against us, making sure that we offer ourselves the best possible protection whilst being in the service of the client and acknowledging the difficulties they may be having. Now, we have some more specific audience questions, and one that comes up time and time again, but we're very grateful for, says, I'm starting as a trainee counsellor with my placement. Apparently, they do have insurance, but do I need to take out personal insurance to include professional indemnity and public liability?
Okay, so this very much depends on what the contract between the counsellor and the placement provider says. So generally, if you're employed, so somebody pays you a salary less tax and national insurance, so you're an employee, you shouldn't need to take out your own insurance because your employer or the placement provider will be vicariously liable for anything that you do. If that's not the case and it's a contract that for you to provide services, then essentially you're a subcontractor, and in that situation you would require to have your own cover in your own name.
So it's interesting, Dan. So I suspect, and this is probably not a question that we could answer here, is our placement counsellors subcontractors are employed? And I guess that's a question you need to ask to your placements, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, it depends what that contract says. Your contract should specify what that situation is. And generally, as I say, an easy definition, if you're employed, you would receive a salary less tax and national insurance. If you just get payments or you're just a volunteer, although you can still be classed as an employee if you're a volunteer, you would be a subcontractor. But yes, ask the question. And just to sort of preempt, what we're going to talk about in the future, we do have a legal helpline attached to our policies so that our policyholders can call, and that's exactly the sort of question that they could ask. Is this contract making me responsible for my own insurance? Am I an employee or not? So there is assistance there to help you with those types of legal queries, which can be a bit baffling for those of us who are not contract experts.
So I guess the call to action or the takeaway for anyone who is a student counsellor may be to get it in writing off their placement, how it's enacted, how insurance is enacted and activated, and are they actually covered? Because if you have it in writing, then you have a bigger element, I think, of security, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
The final question that's come in, and I think this may be insurance company specific. Someone's asked, my client notes have to be anonymised, but my insurance company says the client name needs to be on the notes, and they'd appreciate your thoughts on this, Joe.
It's not something that the Howden policy requires. We don't necessarily feel that it's our position to tell you what or how to keep your notes. That's really professional association guidance, I would suggest. But no, there is no requirement under the Howden policy to have anonymised or unanonymised records.
Yes, so I think that's insurance policy specific or insurance provider specific. So as Joe said, Howden's doesn't ask you to do that, but I think if you're with another insurance provider, you need to check up on that and again get that in writing from them. And then finally, what other support do Howden's offer for practitioners? Okay,
so I touched on the legal helpline. So that's a 24-hour, 365 days a year helpline that our individual clients can access for legal help on all sorts of things, the contracting situation being a good example of that. There's also some extensions under the policy that provide further cover beyond the complaints and the claims in the civil courts. So things like release of confidential information extension. So if you are asked to release information and you really don't feel that it's in the client's best interest, there is an extension under the policy for a solicitor to help you make representations to a judge as to why a partial or non-disclosure should be made, which can be very, very useful in keeping the main bit of the records confidential and only giving the relevant information pertaining to a particular court case, for example.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
Another element of cover that we've got in there, which is useful, is for non-payment or requests for refunds of fees. I must say that caveat, it is in relation to dissatisfaction with services, but if a client of a counsellor doesn't pay their fees and says they're not paying them because they're not happy with the services, we can step in and fill that gap financially and to smooth things over with the client to make sure that they don't make a claim and that the non-payment of the fees is an end to the situation.
Well, I mean, I think that's really, really comprehensive, Joe. And I've learned so much today. I've spent a lot of time speaking with students and qualified colleagues about the importance of insurance. But it's really kind of expanded my awareness And I certainly know a lot more than when we started this interview. So Jo Mountain, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Rory. It's been a pleasure.
A big thank you to Jo Mountain and to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And of course, to all of those in our Facebook group that posed those questions, and is an important topic. And I'm glad that we covered it. We covered it here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This has been episode 216.
Yes, we started the Counselling Foundations with the skill of challenge. And then we moved on to focus on self when friends ask for counselling. And finally, we finished off with that wonderful interview with Jo Mountain from Howden Insurance Brokers, who spoke about all things counselling related when it comes to insurance. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.